All right. So have you guys ever wondered why there's kind of a major persona about like the Jewish banker, right? And basically where I'm going with this is a bit of a book review about the Warburgs. And this one's The Warburgs by Ron Chernow. Bit of a boat anchor. But it was really good for one. But two, it kind of sparked my interest, or not the book itself sparked my interest, but I've had this interest as I've been studying kind of monetary history and noticed this kind of persona of the Jewish banker. And you kind of just always hear, I guess, jokes about it. I don't know if it's just kind of a niche thing or what, but it's always perked my interest, we'll say. And probably the biggest component that kind of parlayed myself into getting this book and going through it, because it's a bit of an investment of time to read, being almost, or at least this one's about 800 pages. The Amazon version, it's a different print, but it says like 880, I believe. So it's a bit of a time to read. You can also get, it's on Audible and that sort of thing, so you can also listen to it. But was kind of my study of the Federal Reserve and Paul Warburg, and kind of being known as, say, like the father of the Federal Reserve and that sort of thing, and kind of looking at that history itself. And from there, I kind of got interested in his whole family for the most part as kind of a side thing. And this is what this book really does, right? And I just kind of Ron Chernow in general. A little bit about him is he's an American writer, journalist, and biographer. Has the best-selling historical nonfiction biographies. I did one of his as the House of Morgan, right? And that was a really good one. It won a few awards, I believe. Forget which ones, but I don't know. I just really like the way that he writes. And I don't know. I retain a lot more. I don't know if it's just because the way he portrays the information, even though it's history and nonfiction. It's just, it keeps me engaged. It might be more of obviously that's anecdotal and it's more personal, but it's still, I enjoy it regardless. I retain a lot more of the information. But who exactly are the Warburgs, right? It's kind of a Jewish banking dynasty, or not just banking. They were also in business, banking, politics, and society, and they have quite the repertoire of, I guess, people. I don't know. Just the family in general was very diverse, right? So they had, it seemed like a big family. He has a family tree in the front, at least of this print. Again, the one on Amazon has a different cover and has a different amount of pages, so it might be just printed differently. But this one has a long family tree in it. It really goes into where the Warburgs kind of branched off, right? To where they had the Alsterufer and then the Mittelweg ones. So kind of like two separate lines, and then you had one that stayed in Germany and one that came to America. And they kind of, for kind of in a pun, so to say, because their name is the Warburgs, but he always talks about how there was basically a war between the two sides of the family, for most of it, it seemed. And basically it goes down between, like, you know, where you had Sigmund and Warburg, and really where it branches off is with Sigmund, who lived from 1835 to 1889, and then he had Moritz, which was 1838 to 1910, right? And Moritz was the Mittelweg branch, right? And so, and Moritz is where you had Paul Warburg and that kind of branch. And they also had a few other interesting characters, we'll say. And I don't want to get too into like the actual content of the book itself, because that's really what, you know, the book is for, and so you can read it or listen to it yourself. This is more of just kind of explaining why and a little bit about it, a little bit about the book, and then kind of why you should read it, so to say. But why were the Warburgs important, right? And just kind of showing not just their importance, but in general, they intermarried a lot with like the shifts and the lobes, and so they really kind of, in terms of the whole Wall Street persona back then, of, you know, in like the the end of the 19th century to the early to mid 20th century, right? When you had the whole kind of growth of Wall Street, so to say. This is where they were really well integrated into like Kuhnloeb, right? And so you hear a lot about them specifically, in that respect, from in the book The House of Morgan, of basically how they were rivals with the Morgans in that respect, right? But anyways, to kind of continue on, a lot of this book itself is just kind of the saga of the family, and kind of their in-depth experience in like World War II, because you could imagine being a very, very prominent Jewish family living in Hamburg during the rise of Hitler and all that kind of stuff leads to an interesting history, right? And so there's that. And he breaks it up into 5 different parts, and I'll just kind of name the parts to kind of show you, because he definitely uses a nice kind of story arc to describe the history of the family itself throughout history. So part 1 was the emergence of the Warburgs, and then you had the rise of the Mittelweg ones, the fall of the Mittelweg ones, and then you had the wartime interregnum, which kind of like World War II itself, and then you had the return of the Alsterufer and Mittelweg Warburgs, right? And so he really did have kind of like a major fall of the family itself, to where they were kind of ostracized for a little bit, and then they kind of came back, right? And again, I don't want to go too far into the actual story itself, and the actual family itself, just because that's really what the book is for again. And also, again, it being 800 something pages, depending on your print, is kind of, that would be a very long video. I think the audiobook's like 25 hours or something like that if you listen to it continuously, and that may be because I listened to it on like 1.5 times. But either way, one thing to note, and I will bring this up and I'll put a link in the description of the video itself, but there is something called the Warburg Institute, which is actually talked about a few times in the book, following the story of A.B. Warburg, right? Because basically he was obsessed with books, started a library, and was kind of we'll put it lightly, as saying a nuisance on the rest of the brothers, or the Warburg brothers, for funding and that sort of thing, to basically have his obsession of a library, which I kind of relate to somehow. But either way, in World War II, because his library was in Hamburg to begin with, but obviously with the rise of what happened in World War II, that kind of came to an end, so to say. And so basically they ended up moving to London, and now it's the Warburg Institute, School of Advanced Study, University of London. And they have a whole bunch of stuff. Like there's like library research, you can get printed electronic journals and that sort of thing. It really goes into the Warburg library and other stuff that are in there. So I'll put a link to the general, like the homepage of the website for that if you guys want to look at it, because I'll probably look at it a bit more. And I don't know, just the history itself is pretty interesting in general, I thought. And once again, this is the cover of the book that I got. The one on Amazon has a different cover, and again, it seems like it's a little bit longer, so it's probably just printed differently. But this one has like a bunch of pictures and that sort of thing. But it really goes into kind of, it's not just a saga of the Warburg family itself. It really goes into kind of Jewish history and talks about Jewish history through them through this time. And also explains a lot of the reasons. I believe it was actually in the very beginning of the book, or relatively close to the book. Beginning of the book, I should say. About how, see if I can actually find it. I don't know, might be just in the prelude. But talks about how basically the German Jews were treated and why. And not just talking about World War II, just in general. And kind of the, we'll say the Germanic kind of reasons behind it, right? There was one thing that I remember off the top of my head would be basically that the Germans, obviously a long time ago, I'm assuming like early 18th centuries, or 1800s or so, whatever it happens to be. But something about how they believed that like the Jews would basically drink the blood of Christian children and that sort of thing, to kind of give kind of the superstition vibe to the anti-Semitism that there was at some point. I don't know. Again, it's one of those, it's being 800 something pages, I'm going to have to go through again, and probably multiple times. But it's still an interesting book, and I like to come on here and talk about them kind of the first time that I do it, or after I finish a book, and then just to kind of give a general overview of not only just what I've retained, but just kind of talk about it in general. That's really helpful for you guys. But again, I also like the way that Ron Chernow kind of creates the chapters, because each one has a general theme like a chapter should, but it's really about like a single person and a single like part of their life, so to say, right? It's not kind of like it's very, very selective and very in-depth for each chapter, right? They aren't superficial in content or context at all, and it's thoroughly enjoyable, I thought. But that being said, I'm going to leave this one here, and so I'm going to put a Card to the House of Morgan video up in the top right corner, just because same author, relatively the same topic, and those are both books that I'm going to be going through multiple times, because there's a lot of information in there, and you just can't retain all of it at once, obviously. But anyways, I'm going to leave this one here, so I hope to see you guys there.